Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. You ready to dive into a story?
Yeah, absolutely. Always up for a good story.
Well, today's story is captivating for sure, but it's also pretty unsettling. It's one of those stories that reveals a dark chapter in American medical history.
I can already sense this one's going to stay with us.
It will. It really will. And it raises profound questions about ethics and race and the pursuit of knowledge.
Issues that, unfortunately, are still very relevant today.
Exactly. Today we're going to explore the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. A 40-year study conducted on African-American men in Macon County, Alabama.
A study that has left a long and troubled legacy.
Absolutely. So before we get into the details, the unsettling details, I should say, let's set the stage a little bit.
Okay, let's go back in time.
It's 1932. The Great Depression is ravaging the country, and Macon County is one of the poorest counties in America.
A time of immense hardship for so many.
It was. Many residents were sharecroppers, tied to the land, struggling to make ends meet.
And in such desperate times, the promise of free medical care would have been incredibly enticing.
Absolutely. And that's where the Public Health Service comes in.
Yeah.
This was the precursor to today's CDC. They partnered with the Tuskegee Institute.
A historically black college?
Yes, to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African-American men.
Now, it's important to remember that treatments for syphilis back then were pretty dangerous.
Right. They involved arsenic-based compounds.
Which could have really severe side effects, even death.
So on the surface, the idea of studying the disease's natural course, it might have seemed somewhat reasonable.
I can see how, in that context, it might have appeared justified.
But, and this is a big but, the way the study was conducted was, well, deeply flawed from the very beginning.
This is where the ethical lines start to blur.
Yeah. Researchers enrolled 600 men in the study.
399 with syphilis and 201 at the fall.
But here's the catch. These men were never explicitly told they had syphilis.
Instead, they were told they were being treated for bad blood.
Right, which was a very common term at the time, but it didn't really convey the seriousness of their condition.
No, not at all. It was a way of downplaying the truth.
Exactly. And that right there is a fundamental violation of informed consent. I mean, these men had no idea what they were really consenting to.
They thought they were getting free health care for a variety of ailments.
Yeah.
Completely unaware that they were actually part of a study to observe the progression of a potentially fatal disease.
And that's where the story gets really, really disturbing.
What happened?
Well, initially, the men received some treatment, but it was those risky arsenic-based compounds we talked about. But here's where things take a truly awful turn. By 1947, penicillin had become widely available.
And it was proven to be a safe and effective cure for syphilis.
Right. This was a game changer for syphilis treatment.
A medical breakthrough.
But it had a very different impact on the Tuskegee study.
Are you saying they didn't offer the men penicillin?
They didn't, even though they knew it could cure them.
Even though they knew? That's inconceivable.
It is. But the researchers deliberately withheld penicillin from these men. They even actively prevented them from receiving treatment elsewhere.
It's hard to believe that a cure was readily available, yet it was kept from these men.
I know. And the researchers tried to justify their actions. They said they had this, quote-unquote, unique opportunity to observe the full course of untreated syphilis.
But that justification completely ignores a fundamental ethical principle. The well-being of the individual should never be sacrificed for the sake of scientific knowledge.
And the deception didn't stop there.
Really? What else did they do?
The researchers used all sorts of misleading tactics to keep the men in the study. For example, they needed to get these men to undergo painful spinal taps,
Ow.
which were purely for research purposes, not treatment at all. But to get the men to agree, they sent letters advertising it as a special free treatment.
The level of manipulation is just appalling.
These men were treated like lab rats. Their lives, their well-being, completely disregarded.
It's truly heartbreaking. It's hard to really grasp the magnitude of this betrayal. I mean, for 40 years, these men were denied a life-saving treatment.
40 years. And what about the effects, the long-term effects of untreated syphilis?
Well, untreated syphilis, it can lead to some really serious complications. Heart problems, blindness, paralysis, dementia even, and, of course, death.
So these men, they were not only denied a cure, but they were left to suffer the devastating consequences of a preventable disease.
Exactly. And the study's impact, it didn't stop with the men themselves. It extended to their families, too. Because syphilis can be transmitted, from mother to child during pregnancy.
Leading to congenital syphilis in infants.
Right.
It's just this chain of suffering that could have been stopped with penicillin.
It really is.
And it's here that the study's racist underpinnings become even more evident.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the beliefs at the time was that African-American men were less likely to seek medical care,
And that made them, quote unquote, ideal subjects for a study of untreated syphilis.
which is just, so disturbing.
It is. It's a really stark reminder of how deeply ingrained racism can be in scientific research. It shapes not only the questions that are asked.
But also the way those questions are answered.
Precisely. And there was another assumption, too, deeply, deeply rooted in the racist ideology of the time, that African Americans were somehow inherently different from white Americans.
Both physically and mentally.
Right.
So they were seen as expendable, their lives less valuable than the knowledge that the researchers thought this study would produce.
It's a chilling thought, but it aligns with the kind of the paternalistic and dehumanizing attitudes that were so prevalent in the medical establishment back then, especially towards African Americans.
It's mind-boggling that this study continues for as long as it did. Were there no voices of dissent? Did no one see what was happening and try to stop it?
There were dissenters, yeah, absolutely. Both within the public health service and outside of it, people who raised concerns about the morality of the study. But those concerns were largely ignored or dismissed.
Why? Why weren't those concerns taken more seriously?
Well, that's a tough question, a complicated one. But there are probably several factors at play. I mean, for one, the study had the backing of some very powerful institutions. The Public Health Service, the Tuskegee Institute.
So the weight of authority silenced those dissenting voices.
In a way, yes. And remember, this was a time when racial segregation was still the norm. The voices of African Americans, particularly those from poor rural communities, well, their voices just weren't heard. They didn't have the same platform.
So basically it was this perfect storm. You had institutional power, you had societal racism, and you had the vulnerability of the study participants themselves. And all of those factors allowed this to go on for 40 years.
That's right.
So who finally brought this to light?
Well, it wasn't until 1972 that a Public Health Service venereal disease investigator by the name of Peter Buxton decided to take a stand.
Buxton. He was the whistleblower. The one who finally exposed this to the world. What made him do it?
Well, Buxton, he joined the service in 1966. And right from the start, he was troubled by the ethical implications of the study. He voiced his concerns repeatedly. Within the Public Health Service, he argued that the men were being exploited, that the study had no real scientific merit, but nobody listened.
And he felt he had to go public.
He did, and he understood the risks. The risk to his career, the risk to the reputation of the Public Health Service itself. But he felt he had a moral obligation to expose the truth.
And when he did, when the story broke, what happened?
It caused a huge uproar across the country.
Yeah, I can imagine.
People were just horrified by what they learned.
By the way, this had been going on for so long.
Right. I mean, how could anyone possibly defend a study like that? Once it became public knowledge.
What was the fallout?
Oh, it was swift. It was decisive. The study was immediately shut down, and Congress launched investigations into the ethical and scientific failings.
What about the men who had been part of the study? The survivors? What happened to them?
Well, the survivors and their families, they filed a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government.
Yeah.
And it resulted in a $10 million settlement and a commitment to provide free health care to the survivors and their families.
Which is some measure of justice, I guess, though no amount of money can really compensate for what they went through.
Absolutely not. But the Tuskegee Syphilis Study became a symbol of medical racism and exploitation. And it really damaged the trust between African Americans and the medical community.
A legacy that I think we're still grappling with today.
We are. It's true.
So we've talked about the immediate impact of the Tuskegee study, but the repercussions went far beyond just the suffering of those involved. It really changed the landscape of medical research.
It did. It really did. The study sparked a national conversation about research ethics. And that led to some pretty major reforms and safeguards to protect people participating in research.
Okay, so tell me more about those changes. What were some of the most important things that came out of this?
Well, one of the biggest things, one of the most significant outcomes was the passage of the National Research Act in 1974.
Okay.
This act mandated that any institution that was doing research involving human subjects, they had to have something called an institutional review board.
An institutional review board?
Yeah, or an IRB for short.
Okay, so what do IRBs do? Why are they so important?
Okay, so basically IRBs are these independent committees that review research proposals to make sure that they're meeting ethical standards. So they look at the potential risks and benefits to people who are going to be in the study. And they scrutinize the informed consent process, make sure that everything's on the up and up.
Yeah.
And they also make sure that vulnerable populations are protected.
So like the men in Tuskegee.
Exactly. The men in Tuskegee, their primary goal is to safeguard the well-being and rights of anyone participating in research.
It sounds like IRBs are a direct response to what happened with the Tuskegee study.
Yeah, they really are. The Tuskegee study was like this huge wake-up call. It showed everybody what can go wrong when you don't have ethical guidelines in place, when research ethics are just tossed aside. So IRBs now are kind of this critical checkpoint. They help make sure that research is being conducted ethically and responsibly.
And the idea of informed consent, that's at the very core of ethical research now.
Absolutely. The Tuskegee study really drove home the importance of getting truly informed consent from participants. So now anyone who is going to be part of a study, they have to be fully informed about the nature of the research. They have to know the potential risks, the potential benefits, and they have to know that they can pull out of the study at any time. They're not obligated to stay.
It's kind of amazing to think that something so horrible actually led to these really fundamental changes in the way research is done. But the Tuskegee study really left its mark. It really damaged the trust between African Americans and the medical community.
It did. It really did.
How? I mean, how did that manifest itself?
Well, it really reinforced a lot of the existing fears and suspicions that a lot of people in the Black community already had about the healthcare system.
Yeah.
Many African Americans saw the study as proof that the system was inherently racist and that their lives and well-being just didn't matter.
And that mistrust is something we're still dealing with.
We are. The legacy of Tuskegee, it continues to cast a long shadow. It's part of the reason why there are still health disparities, why there's still vaccine hesitancy, and why some African Americans are reluctant to participate in medical research.
It's just a tragic reminder of how deep that mistrust runs and how hard it is to rebuild trust once it's been broken.
It is. And rebuilding trust takes time. It takes transparency and accountability. And it takes a genuine commitment to really addressing the historical and systemic factors that have created these disparities.
So was anyone ever held responsible for what happened in Tuskegee?
Well, there were investigations. There were a lot of reports, but no one was ever criminally charged for their role in the study.
No one. It's hard to believe that something so wrong that no one was actually held accountable legally.
I know. It's a really difficult thing to accept. But there was an important step towards acknowledgement and reconciliation.
Okay.
In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the surviving participants of the study and their families on behalf of the United States.
Wow.
And in that apology, he acknowledged the shameful and racist nature of the study, and he expressed remorse for the pain that had been inflicted on these men and their loved ones.
But an apology is important, but it doesn't erase the pain.
No, of course not. But it was an essential step, a step towards acknowledging the wrong that had been done and beginning to heal.
The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is one of those stories that it stays with you. It makes you think about the power of science, but it also makes you think about what happens when ambition goes unchecked, and how important it is to have those ethical boundaries. And it's a story about race, about inequality, and about how mistrust can last for generations.
It is, and it's a reminder that we have to be vigilant. We always have to be watching out for the rights and well-being of everyone, especially the people who are most vulnerable.
Well, thank you for taking us on this journey through such a difficult and dark chapter in American history.
It's been my pleasure.
It's a story that I think really challenges us to confront some really uncomfortable truths and to hope for a future where these kinds of injustices, these horrible things, just don't happen again.
Absolutely. We can never forget the lessons of Tuskegee.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. But the conversation, like you said, it doesn't end here. We want our listeners to think about what they've learned and to consider how this story, this one study, continues to impact how we think about medical ethics and research and the really complex relationship between race and healthcare.
And remember, history has a way of repeating itself if we don't pay attention to its warnings.
That's a powerful thought. Thank you for listening.